Welcome back to the world of Eichard. We're finishing up Unit 6 today with topics 6.6 and 6.7. Both are about migration from 1750 to 1900. Here's the required content for 6.6, Causes of Migration in an Interconnected World. Let's start with this part. Migration in many cases was influenced by changes in demographics in both industrialized and unindustrialized societies that presented challenges to existing patterns of living. Demographic challenges were mainly the rapid population growth, which took place in both industrialized and unindustrialized societies. And this led to both internal migration, people relocating within the same country, and external migration, people going to new countries. A significant portion of these people migrated to cities, which contributed to global urbanization. This was all made possible because of the new transportation methods we discussed in topic 5.5, especially railroads and steamships. Generally speaking, railroads facilitated internal migration and steamships facilitated external migration. Migration was not a new thing in world history by this point. It's a continuity. In Unit 4, we saw both voluntary migration of Europeans and the involuntary migration of enslaved Africans to colonies in the Americas. And we can go even further back to when we discussed diasporic merchant communities in Unit 2. But the speed and affordability of travel meant that much larger populations of people were now able to migrate. And because of the same transportation technology, unlike previous eras, many of these migrants were able to return to their homelands. This was a big change. Now let's look at some examples. Let's start with an example of an internal migration within an industrialized society, and one that we've already seen before. We saw in topic 5.3 how Britain's agricultural revolution and industrial revolution led to urbanization, since population increased due to the abundance of food, and since many of those people were no longer needed to work on the more efficient farms. They migrated to cities, making use of Britain's rapidly increasing network of railroads. From 1800 to 1850, Britain's urban population doubled, mostly as a result of internal migration from the countryside to cities like Manchester and London. Another example of internal migration was in Japan, which we saw in 5.6 had its own rapid industrial revolution as a result of the Meiji Restoration. Here as well, the urban population increased substantially as peasant farmers migrated to industrial cities like Tokyo and Yokohama, where they often got jobs in the industrial sector. And it was all facilitated by expanding railroad networks. In both Britain and Japan, these migrants moved largely because they faced challenges associated with the changing nature of the industrial economy. And both are examples of this section here with an economics focus. Many individuals freely chose to relocate in search of work. The most pronounced example of external migration was people from Europe migrating to the Americas, especially the United States. Around 30 million Europeans migrated to the US from 1820 to 1930, many of those from industrialized countries like Britain and Germany, due to demographic pressures of growing populations, freely migrating in search of work. A notable example were the Irish. Over 6 million of them migrated to the US, mostly in the 19th and early 20th century. Between 1800 and 1841, Ireland's population almost doubled, largely driven by the successful cultivation of potatoes. In fact, much of the population growth that caused the demographic challenges facing people in the 19th century was a result of the crops from the Americas, like corn and potatoes, that were made available in the Columbian Exchange many centuries before. This was true in places throughout Europe, but also in China, India, and many other places, leading to an increase in emigration. When blight affected the potato crop in the 1840s, this led to the Great Irish Famine, and in this decade alone, more than 1 million people emigrated, mostly to the US. Millions of Italians also migrated out of Italy, especially from poorer southern regions like Naples and Sicily. Most went to the US, but also a substantial amount to Latin America, especially Argentina. They fled demographic challenges and often got jobs in Argentinian cities like Buenos Aires, working in the manufacturing, construction, and service industries. Many of these Italian migrants returned back to Italy after working for a while, which was possible because of relatively affordable passage on steamships. But many of these migrants remained, making a big impact on Argentina's cultural and demographic landscape. Another example of migrants who returned to their homelands were Japanese agricultural workers in the Pacific region. Many peasants in Japan were displaced due to land and tax reforms associated with the Meiji Restoration and modernization. We already saw how many of them migrated internally to cities within Japan, but there was also a substantial amount of external migration of these peasants who used their agricultural skills working on plantations in the Pacific, in places like Hawaii. Just as we saw with the Italians in Argentina, many of these Japanese workers decided to return home, but many also remained, and there is a substantial population of Japanese descent in Hawaii to this day. In topic 6.4, we discussed the massive changes in the new globalist economy, but we also need to keep in mind the continuities. This new global capitalist economy continued to rely on coercive labor systems. Look at the United States, which was both an industrialized state and also an export economy. The slaveholding South cultivated raw cotton using slave labor, exporting it to Britain, but also to the northern United States, which had its own textile factories. In fact, slavery expanded in the US because of the increase in demand for cotton, until it was finally abolished after the Civil War in 1865. Another type of labor system that should be familiar from Unit 4 is indentured servitude. In Unit 4, this was mostly Europeans, who migrated to places like the British colonies in North America, where they signed a contract to work for a specified period of time in order to pay off a debt. In Unit 6, we see the required example of Chinese and Indian indentured servitude. In principle, it was the same, with these Chinese and Indian workers signing a similar type of contract. But in practice, this new form of indentured labor was much more exploitative. They were put on ships and sent to work in many places, including the British Caribbean colonies, islands in the Pacific like Fiji, and various parts of Africa. Technically, this was all voluntary, but the employers often misled the laborers into signing contracts they did not understand. Before the work even began, these indentured servants owed money for the trip that they could not pay, putting them in a state of debt bondage. Although not technically slavery, this system of indentured servitude meant that its laborers were forced into a system they could now legally not escape. And the working conditions were also often terrible and dangerous, working in tropical climates with little rest and forced to live in poorly constructed shacks. They were also often abused and referred to as coolies, a derogatory term. The last coercive labor system was convict labor, which was used especially by the British. It involved the use of criminals as laborers. These prisoners were sent overseas, most famously to Australia, which was used as a penal colony. Convict laborers worked on settler farms and ranches, in mining or construction. Most of these convicts ended up becoming settlers and added to the growing European population in Australia. Now here's the required content for 6.7, effects of migration. This first part here is about the effects on the home societies of these migrants. Since these migrants tended to be men, that left a demographic imbalance behind. China and India, of course, had huge populations, and the migrations barely made a dent in their overall population. But most of these examples came from specific regions. For example, the Pearl River Delta in southern China was a major source of indentured laborers, who were mostly male. And when they left, it was often women there who had to take on extra work in rice farming. The Punjab region of North India saw a similar phenomenon, to the point that by the early 20th century, women were doing a majority of the farming work there. This next part is about how the migrant communities created ethnic enclaves inside the places they moved to, bringing their culture with them. In the United States, there are countless examples of ethnic enclaves from the period before 1900 all the way up to the present day. Little Italy in New York, Chinatown in San Francisco, South Boston in Massachusetts. Singapore in Southeast Asia has a large population of both Indians and Chinese, largely as a result of this period of migration from Unit 6. As for cultural practices, the most obvious are language and food. If you visited one of these places, you'd find businesses with signs in the language of the migrants, and restaurants serving their authentic style food. This food often became popular with the people in the receiving societies. Have you ever tried spaghetti or Chinese fried rice? How about Indian curry? If you have, it's likely a cultural effect of migration. Sadly, though, the receiving societies were often not as willing to accept the new migrants as much as they were willing to accept their cuisine. The last section is about ethnic and racial prejudice they faced, and laws passed to regulate migration. Initially, the Irish in the US were treated with suspicion and stereotyped as drunken criminals. Italians were also treated unfavorably. The Chinese experienced violent racism in the US and were victims of several massacres, including the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 and the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885, and were explicitly targeted by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited further Chinese migration there. This was the first anti-immigration law in the US. Then there was the White Australia policy in Australia, which was a series of acts designed to promote only European immigration and specifically restricted migration from Pacific Islanders. And that's all for Unit 6. We'll see you next time in the 20th century. Until then, keep thinking like the College Board.